didn't make dessert. Oh, instead, I made some fun.
I always cry when I'm hungry.
Wendy's introduces their new beef hot dogs.
The best meals you've never tasted are hiding between yellowed pages and handwritten notes. These forgotten recipes were once family staples, strange, resourceful, and full of soul. You won't find them online, only in the cookbooks your grandparents left behind. Imagine showing up to a party and seeing a potato salad you could slice. That is exactly what the party potato salad loaf was. A retro showstopper straight from the 1950s, this dish was more than just food, it was architecture. Cold potatoes were mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, pickles, olives, and sometimes even bits of ham or hard-boiled egg. Then, everything got pressed into a loaf pan and chilled until it was firm enough to slice clean like a pound cake. Some folks even garnished it with parsley sprigs or piped mayonnaise like frosting. You were not just eating lunch, you were unwrapping a sculpture. And while the idea of molded potato salad might make you squint today, back then it was a proud display of frugal creativity and culinary presentation. It sat at the center of potlucks, church dinners, and holiday spreads, part decor, part dinner. And let us be honest, nobody remembers how it tasted. They just remember how it looked. But if you thought molded potato salad was the end of the story, wait until you see what they did with chicken and peas. There was a time when chicken wiggle was not just a dish, it was a sensation. Served hot over toast or cold on crackers, it was a creamy mixture of chopped chicken and green peas swimming in a white sauce. You would thicken it with flour, stretch it with milk, and season it just enough to feel fancy. Why the name? Some say it came from the way the peas would wiggle when you scooped it up. Others think it was just a marketing gimmick that stuck. This was comfort food on a budget. If you had leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, you stretched it into meals for the next 2 days. The peas gave it color, the sauce gave it texture, and the toast? That was your edible plate. Chicken wiggle was also big in community cookbooks, shared from one frugal family to the next, proudly served at luncheons and tea parties like it was the Queen's favorite snack. Sure, it may not make a comeback in the Instagram era, but back then, it was a household hero. And if you think that was the only time people turned meat into spreadable magic, wait until you hear about the loaf that became a mousse. Do not let the word mousse fool you. This is not dessert. Ham mousse was a cold, savory spread made from ground ham, cream cheese, gelatin, and a whisper of mustard or Worcestershire sauce. It was mixed until fluffy, chilled until firm, and served in copper-toned molds shaped like fish, rings, or stars. Sometimes it even had olives pressed in for dramatic flair. You would slice it like cake or spread it on Ritz crackers. Either way, it was considered downright classy. It was the centerpiece of every suburban buffet, bridal shower, and bridge night in the mid-century, and it was always cold. If your grandmother had a special gelatin mold hanging in her kitchen, this was probably what it was for. And why ham? Because it was cheap, it was salty, and it held its own. The gelatin gave it that signature jiggle, and the cream cheese smoothed it all out. It may sound strange now, but this was the golden child of savory elegance. It looked like you had put in serious work, when really you just blended leftovers and let the fridge do the heavy lifting. But if mousse made from ham does not stop you in your tracks, wait until you hear what they did with liver. Liverloaf was not for the faint of heart, but back then, it was practically a miracle food. A meatloaf-style block made from pureed liver, onions, and breadcrumbs, baked until firm and sliced like lunch meat. It was cheap, packed with iron, and pushed hard by nutritionists as a superfood for wartime families. The taste? That was polarizing. But the practicality? Undeniable. Liver was one of the few cuts not rationed during wartime, and it was loaded with nutrients people desperately needed. Turning it into a loaf meant you could serve slices cold in sandwiches or pan-fried for dinner. Add a dash of ketchup or mustard, maybe some pickles if you had them, and you had yourself a full meal. It was the kind of dish that showed up in government pamphlets with headlines like, "Good for you, easy on the wallet." Sure, it looked like cat food, but when times were hard, Liverloaf stepped up. Kids ate it. Parents served it, and it kept families going through some of the roughest patches in history. Still, Not everything from the old cookbooks was brown, mushy, and meat-based. Some of it was bright, sweet, and glowing orange. Sunshine salad looked like summer in a bowl, even if it was made in the dead of winter. This vintage side dish combined orange gelatin with shredded carrots and crushed pineapple, then poured it all into a mold and chilled it into shape. If you were lucky, you might spot a maraschino cherry floating near the top like a little ruby prize. This was not dessert. It was served with dinner, often alongside meatloaf, ham, or cold cuts. That sweet and tangy mix of fruit and vegetables was a Midwestern miracle, and it became a potluck must-have in the 1950s and 1960s. Some versions added cottage cheese. Others snuck in celery or chopped nuts. It was brightly colored, strangely refreshing, and absolutely everywhere. The reason it stuck around for so long was because it hit all the right buttons. It was cheap, it lasted in the fridge, and it added a splash of color to otherwise beige plates. Kids liked it, adults tolerated it, and for a generation or two, it was a sign that someone had put in the effort. But if you think molded salad is wild, wait until you hear about the soda people drank piping hot, with lemon slices. In the 1960s, when the weather turned cold and central heating was still a luxury for many homes, people reached for something warm and comforting. But instead of hot cocoa or mulled cider, one drink surprisingly took the spotlight: hot Dr. Pepper with lemon. Yes, you heard that right. You would take a bottle of Dr. Pepper, heat it gently in a saucepan until steaming, then drop in a thin slice of lemon and serve it like tea. It was cozy, sweet, slightly spicy, and surprisingly soothing. The citrus cut through the syrup just enough to make it feel like something more sophisticated than soda. The drink was not just a quirky household tradition. It was part of a full-blown advertising campaign. The company promoted it heavily during the colder months as a way to keep soda sales strong even when no one wanted a cold drink. For a while, it worked. Families gathered around the table with mugs of steaming soda in hand. It disappeared almost as quickly as it caught on, but those who grew up with it remember it as a weirdly comforting winter treat. But if heating up soda sounds strange, just wait until we talk about tuna in gelatin. Molded tuna salad may be one of the most infamous relics from mid-century American kitchens. Picture this: canned tuna, chopped celery, green olives, and mayonnaise, all suspended in a clear, wobbly gelatin mold. It was served cold, often on a bed of iceberg lettuce and occasionally garnished with hard-boiled eggs or tiny pickles for flair. This was not some fringe experiment either. It was a legitimate dinner option, frequently featured in women's magazines and community cookbooks. The idea was to take something as humble as tuna salad and turn it into a centerpiece, mold it into a ring, a dome, or a fish shape. Suddenly, Tuesday night dinner looked like a formal event. There was also a practical side to it. Gelatin helped preserve leftovers, stretched ingredients further, and didn't require heating up the stove. And with refrigeration finally becoming common in post-war households, molded salads became a fun way to show off your new appliance. Still, even the bravest of eaters started to question things when their tuna wiggled back. It did not stop people from trying to reinvent the wheel, though, sometimes literally. Next up, a crown-shaped roast made entirely out of hot dogs. Now we are entering territory that feels more like food sculpture than actual food. The stuffed crown roast of Frankfurters was exactly what it sounds like: a bunch of hot dogs arranged upright in a perfect circle, tied together to form a roast-like ring and stuffed with mashed potatoes or sauerkraut in the middle. This was the definition of budget creativity. You took one of the cheapest proteins available, hot dogs, and made them the star of the show. The center stuffing gave it the illusion of a real roast, which made it perfect for Sundays or special occasions when you wanted to impress but could not spend. It looked theatrical, and honestly, a little ridiculous. But people loved it. It was fun. It was easy. It made dinner feel like a celebration when resources were limited. The kids thought it was hilarious. The grown-ups thought it was clever. And the guests? Well, they definitely remembered it. Some even experimented with stuffing the center with baked beans, macaroni salad, or even scrambled eggs depending on the time of day. Whatever you had lying around could go in the middle. It was a build-your-own roast fantasy. But if hot dogs pretending to be high cuisine sounds inventive, the next recipe gets even bolder: meatballs that turn into porcupines. Porcupine meatballs were not named for their ingredients. They were named for how they looked. Made from ground beef mixed with uncooked white rice, the meatballs would be simmered in tomato sauce or broth until the rice began to poke out like little spines, hence the name. This was frugal food that worked overtime. The rice bulked out the beef, making a small portion stretch across multiple meals. And while they may have looked like culinary oddities, porcupine meatballs were beloved. They had a soft, comforting texture, soaked up whatever sauce you used, and could be served with mashed potatoes, noodles, or even just on plain white bread. What made them stand out was their adaptability. If you did not have ground beef, you could use ground turkey, pork, or a combination of whatever you had on hand. Some families even flavored them with onion soup mix or a splash of vinegar to give the sauce more kick. These meatballs showed up in lunchboxes, weeknight dinners, and community center potlucks. And the best part? Kids loved the name. Any food that sounded like a cartoon animal already had a foot in the door, but not every dish from the past leaned on meat. Some desserts went all in on gelatin and cheese, yes, at the same time. Cottage cheese JellO pie may sound like a dare, but it was actually a very real, very popular, no-bake dessert. The process was simple. Take a flavored gelatin, whip it up with cottage cheese and whipped topping, and pour it into a graham cracker crust. Chill until firm. Serve cold. That was it. And yes, it was a hit. You would think the texture would be off-putting, but somehow it worked. The tartness of the cottage cheese balanced out the sweetness of the gelatin, and the crust gave it structure. Lime JellO was a fan favorite, though orange and cherry were also common. Sometimes people folded in fruit cocktail or pineapple chunks. This was another example of how families stretched their pantries. Fresh dairy could be expensive or hard to store, but cottage cheese lasted longer and was easier to find. Plus, gelatin was practically a food group in mid-century America. You could buy it in bulk, flavor it yourself, and mold it into anything. This pie was a staple at bake sales, baby showers, and backyard picnics. It felt modern at the time, even if today it feels more like something from a laboratory. But if you thought molded pie was the most unusual shape food could take, just wait until you see what they did with deviled ham in a ring mold. You know a dish is serious when it comes in a ring. The deviled ham ring was a cold, molded marvel that took the humble ham sandwich filling and gave it the full dinner party treatment. You would blend deviled ham, usually canned, with mayonnaise, chopped celery, relish, and a hint of mustard, then mix it with unflavored gelatin to help it keep its shape. Next step? Pour it into a ring mold and chill it until it was firm enough to hold. Once it's set, the fun began. The hollow center was filled with a contrasting salad. Think potato, macaroni, or even peas and carrots in mayonnaise. Sometimes people got real fancy and garnished the top with sliced olives or pimentos, giving it the look of a savory jelly donut. It was the ultimate centerpiece at luncheons and club gatherings. Yes, it was cold. Yes, it wobbled. But it looked like effort, and it tasted like thrift. That combination was gold during the mid-century. What made this dish unforgettable, though, was the presentation. People were obsessed with molded foods back then. Circular, decorative, and slightly surreal. It was like edible Tupperware art. And yet, for all the flair, the filling was pure Depression-era ingenuity. Speaking of which, how do you make an apple pie without apples? You're about to find out. Mock apple pie is one of those recipes that sounds like a joke until you realize how serious people were about it. During the Great Depression, apples were too expensive or just plain unavailable in many parts of the country, so home cooks found a workaround: Ritz crackers. Yes, crackers. They would crumble Ritz crackers into a pie shell, then douse them with a syrup made from sugar, water, lemon juice, cinnamon, and cream of tartar. Once baked, the result looked and tasted surprisingly like real apple pie. The crackers soaked up the syrup and softened just enough to mimic the texture of cooked apples. The trick was so convincing that it became a marketing goldmine for Ritz. The recipe was printed right on the side of the box for years. People made it out of necessity at first, but then it became a tradition. There was something thrilling about fooling your taste buds. In the right light, it was even a party trick. Guess what's in the pie? And if you said crackers, you either got a laugh or a confused stare. Sometimes both. It is a dessert that tells the story of resourcefulness and humor, a little culinary sleight of hand when times were tough. But not everything from those old cookbooks was dessert. Some of it was, well, coffee, with an egg in it. You might think eggs and coffee do not belong in the same sentence, let alone the same pot. But for generations of Scandinavian Americans in the Midwest, egg coffee was a morning ritual. It is exactly what it sounds like, cracking a raw egg into the coffee grounds before boiling them. This strange-sounding process had a very real purpose. The egg binds with the grounds and sinks them to the bottom of the pot, leaving behind an incredibly smooth and mellow brew. No bitterness, no grit, just a clean cup of coffee that could rival anything from a fancy cafe. You would bring water to a boil, mix your coffee grounds with a whole egg, shell and all sometimes, and drop the mixture into the bubbling pot. Let it simmer. Add a splash of cold water to settle the grounds, then pour. It looked rustic, smelled amazing, and tasted even better. It was especially popular in rural communities where fancy percolators or machines were out of reach. All you needed was a stovetop and a little patience. Some people still swear by it. Others, understandably, are a bit squeamish. But there is no denying its place in the story of forgotten American recipes, because sometimes the weirdest ideas lead to the best results. Then again, not every idea from the past was brilliant. Some were just bananas, literally. Banana candle salad is one of those recipes you have to see to believe. Popular in the 1950s and 1960s, it combined fruit, vegetables, and mayonnaise into a dessert, or maybe a side dish, depending on who you asked. Either way, it raised eyebrows. The construction was simple. Place a pineapple ring on a leaf of iceberg lettuce. Stick half a peeled banana upright through the center like a candle. Top the tip with a dollop of mayonnaise or cottage cheese, your flame, and if you were feeling festive, finish it with a cherry. That was it. Sweet, salty, creamy, and crunchy, all at once. Was it delicious? That depends on how much you like mayonnaise with your fruit. But it sure was memorable. Banana candle salad was the kind of thing that made it into children's cookbooks and vintage party guides, praised for being easy, fun, and fancy-looking. It showed up at holiday dinners, bridal showers, and Sunday potlucks, often with guests politely poking at it, unsure of which part to eat first. Still, it was a hit in its time. It was cheap, it used ingredients that never went to waste, and it always sparked a conversation. But if you think combining fruit and mayo was wild, just wait until you see how tomato soup and macaroni joined forces for dinner. There was nothing fancy about canned macaroni and tomato soup bake, but there was nothing forgettable about it either. This Depression-era casserole was built for comfort and survival. A can of tomato soup, a handful of elbow macaroni, maybe some milk to thin it out, and breadcrumbs on top. That was dinner. Sometimes you would add cheese if you had any, or chopped onions, or hot dog slices. It baked up into a soft, tangy, and slightly sweet dish that kids actually liked. It was easy to prepare, impossible to mess up, and cheap enough to serve an entire family. The top layer of toasted breadcrumbs gave it that extra bit of texture, while the soup kept it moist underneath. This casserole never made it into the fine dining scene, but it made its way into countless family traditions. It was a hug in a dish. And just when you thought cereal was only for breakfast, the next recipe shows how people turned a breakfast staple into crispy golden chicken. Before anyone had even heard of panko or air fryers, the crunchy dinner of choice came straight from the breakfast aisle. Cornflake-crusted chicken was one of the most popular recipes ever to come off the back of a cereal box, and for good reason. It was crispy, golden, and baked instead of fried, which made it feel like a healthy win even before people were reading nutrition labels. All you had to do was crush up some cornflakes, dip your chicken in egg or milk, roll it through the cereal coating, and bake until crisp. That was it. This dish hit its stride in the 1950s and 1960s, right around the time when convenience was king in American kitchens. Busy moms needed meals that were quick, satisfying, and made their kids forget they were eating leftovers for the third night in a row. Cornflakes gave that satisfying crunch that felt just indulgent enough. The coating also acted like a flavor sponge. It was also a great way to use up stale cereal. Waste not, want not, right? But if you think that was the only way gelatin snuck into dinner, wait until you see what people were doing with cold poultry and a whole lot of aspic. Jellied chicken or turkey loaf was one of those dishes that made total sense at the time, and almost none now. After a holiday meal or Sunday roast, any leftover poultry got chopped, seasoned, and suspended in a savory gelatin. The loaf was poured into a mold, chilled until firm, and served cold in slices. It might sound odd, but back then, this was peak resourcefulness. Gelatin kept everything together, kept it fresh, and made leftovers feel like a brand new dish. Some versions used chicken broth as the base, while others blended in mayonnaise or a touch of lemon juice for flavor. Bits of celery, onion, and pimento were often added for color and crunch. This dish was a regular at luncheons and family gatherings, sliced into perfect circles or rectangles and placed delicately on lettuce leaves. Served with crackers or a dollop of Miracle Whip, it gave you protein, presentation, and pride, all in one mold. And while cold gelatinous poultry might not exactly make mouths water today, back then it was classy, clever, and cost-efficient. Now, if that does not get you nostalgic, maybe something a little crispier will. Let us talk about how canned fish and creamy peas became a weeknight favorite. Salmon patties with creamed peas were a weeknight dinner classic, especially during the 1940s and 1950s when fresh fish was hard to come by, or far too expensive. Canned salmon, on the other hand, was cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with protein. To make it work, families would mix the salmon with breadcrumbs, egg, and just enough seasoning to hold it all together. Then they would fry the patties in a little oil or butter until golden brown. The outside got crispy, the inside stayed soft, and suddenly that humble can on your shelf turned into a hot meal. But what really tied the dish together was the creamed peas. That white sauce, made with flour, butter, and milk, was poured over everything, softening the patties and giving the dish that rich diner-style comfort. It was warm, creamy, and surprisingly filling. This dish also had a reputation as a crowd pleaser, and when times were lean, it helped that you could feed a family of 5 with one can and a bag of frozen peas. It is the kind of food that quietly did its job, night after night, no spotlight required. But not all Depression-era meals were this straightforward. Some tried to recreate luxury with the humblest ingredients. Just wait until you hear about the time ground beef tried to pass as duck. Mockduck was not some fancy plant-based meat alternative. It was pure Depression-era theater. You would take seasoned ground beef or sausage, roll it flat like a meat carpet, then fill it with stuffing, usually breadcrumbs, onions, maybe a chopped vegetable or two. Then you rolled it up, tied it like a roast, and baked it low and slow. The goal? To create something that looked like a roast duck. It rarely fooled anyone, but it earned a lot of respect for trying. Mock duck was rich in flavor, filling, and far more affordable than real poultry. The stuffing helped stretch the meat, the shape made it feel fancy, and the gravy, always gravy, brought it all together. This was not everyday food. It was for Sundays, holidays, or when you had company coming over and wanted to pretend things were a little better than they were. Families sat down around a table, sliced into that beefy roll, and felt like they were eating high cuisine, even if the closest they got to duck was watching it fly overhead. But not every vintage dish was about deception. Some were just delightfully odd little snacks, especially the kind that mixed peanut butter, raisins, and celery, and called it healthy. Peanut butter stuffed celery with raisins was the reigning champ of after-school snacks and mid-century bridge club menus. It was simple, it was sweet, it was good for you, and it was everywhere. This oddball combination started as a healthy alternative to sugary treats. Celery sticks were filled with a generous smear of peanut butter, then topped with raisins lined up like little ants marching in a row. That is how it earned its unofficial name. ants on a log. Parents and teachers swore by it as a brain food snack, while kids loved it mostly for the fun of lining up the raisins just right. But this snack also made its way into the adult world. It showed up at afternoon teas, church gatherings, and diet cookbooks. Cottage cheese was sometimes used instead of peanut butter. It was endlessly adaptable and endlessly curious. It may not sound like much, but this was snack royalty for a good couple of decades. You could serve it to kids or bring it to a luncheon. Either way, it got the job done. And speaking of curious combos, the next dish proves that lime gelatin, cucumbers, and vinegar once had their moment to shine together. The phrase cucumber lime salad mold sounds like something a mad scientist might cook up during lunch hour. And in a way, that is exactly what it was. A sweet and savory mashup that once proudly graced the tables of mid-century dinner parties. It all started with lime gelatin. Into that green shimmer went sliced cucumbers, chopped onions, vinegar, and sometimes even green peppers. That may sound like a dare in gelatin form today, but back then, it was a cutting-edge salad. This was meant to be served cold, often on a bed of lettuce, maybe with a dollop of mayonnaise or sour cream on top. The cucumbers brought crunch, the onions brought bite, the lime gelatin brought confusion. But somehow, it worked. It was refreshing. You were not just bringing a side dish, you were bringing something that sparkled in the light. It was the kind of thing you could only pull off in an era where no flavor combination was too bold and no dish was too strange to mold. But if savory gelatin makes you blink twice, just wait until you hear about the frozen fruit salad that came with a side of mayo. There was a time when frozen fruit salad was the queen of the dessert table. Not quite a salad, not quite a dessert, definitely not just fruit. This oddball recipe brought together fruit cocktail, whipped topping, and, wait for it, mayonnaise. Yes, you heard that right. Mayonnaise. The ingredients were folded together and poured into muffin tins or gelatin molds, then frozen until firm. The result was a creamy, sweet, slightly tangy treat that slid out in perfect pastel rounds. Some versions added chopped nuts or marshmallows for extra texture. Others stuck to the basics. It was considered elegant, something you served at bridal showers, ladies' luncheons, or holiday dinners. You could make a tray in advance and pull them out right before dessert. No oven required, no stress involved. This dish walked a weird line between being healthy and indulgent. Even though it has mostly disappeared today, frozen fruit salad was once a go-to for mid-century hostesses who wanted to impress without breaking a sweat. It was quirky, colorful, and just a little bit mysterious. But if that sounds unusual, hold on. Because next, we are diving into a casserole made of hot dogs, baked beans, and potato chips. Hot dog casserole with potato chips is one of those meals that could only have come from a time when dinner needed to be fast, cheap, and guaranteed to win over picky eaters. This dish was a kid-friendly marvel built entirely from pantry staples. Here's how it worked. Slice up hot dogs, mix them with canned baked beans, pour everything into a baking dish, and then top it all with a generous layer of crushed potato chips. Bake until bubbly and golden. That was it. No frills, just good, salty fun. This casserole was a regular in homes where tight budgets and big families went hand in hand. It was customizable too. Some folks added onions or cheese. Others used different kinds of beans. You could dress it up or strip it down depending on what was in the cupboard. Plus, it was quick to make and easy to clean up. This was comfort food that felt familiar, even if it looked a little chaotic. It was proof that when creativity meets hunger, anything can happen. Speaking of creative, the next forgotten recipe on our list takes processed cheese and turns it into a surprisingly indulgent dessert. You may want to sit down for this one. Velvita fudge is not a myth. It is a very real recipe that actually graced dessert tables across America. And yes, the main ingredient is that beloved processed cheese brick found in countless refrigerators, Velvita. The logic? Velvita is soft, salty, and meltable. When combined with cocoa powder, butter, and powdered sugar, it creates a rich, creamy texture that is shockingly close to traditional fudge. No one believed it would work until they tasted it. Once the cheese was melted down and mixed in, you could not detect its flavor at all. What you got instead was a deeply chocolatey, ultra-smooth fudge that held its shape and had a slightly salty edge. And in a time when fresh dairy was pricey or hard to store, Velvita offered a smart workaround. For many families, this recipe became a well-kept secret. Something you passed down quietly from one generation to the next, usually prefaced with, "Just try it before you judge it." And if you think Velvita in dessert is strange, you have not seen what happens when maraschino cherries, pineapple, and gelatin come together in a glowing retro mold. The pineapple upside-down ring mold took everything people loved about the traditional upside-down cake and gave it a JellO-era twist. Instead of cake batter, this version used gelatin, typically lemon or pineapple flavored, and molded it into a circular shape with whole pineapple rings and bright red maraschino cherries set carefully in place. But the surprises did not stop there. Into the mix went cottage cheese, yes, again, and sometimes even whipped topping to give the gelatin a creamy texture. You would chill the whole thing in a bundt pan or ring mold until it was firm enough to slice, then serve it cold as a dessert or a very sweet side dish. It was the kind of dish that made people do a double take. Was it a salad? A dessert? A dare? Nobody knew for sure, but it looked festive, tasted sweet, and made everyone feel like they were living a little fancy. It may not be making any comebacks today, but back then, this was a real hit, especially during spring gatherings and Easter brunches. And if molded fruit salad sounds bold, just wait until you meet the meat dish that turned deviled ham into a crown. When meat was scarce and vegetables were running low, families turned to the most basic ingredients, flour and water. Boiled flour dumplings were a way to stretch a meal, creating something filling with almost nothing at all. The recipe was as simple as it gets: flour, a pinch of salt, and just enough water to form a dough. Sometimes, if an egg or a bit of lard was available, it was added for extra texture. The dough was then shaped into small lumps and dropped into boiling water or broth. In wealthier times, dumplings floated on top of a rich stew, soaking up the flavors of meat and vegetables. But during tough times, they were often served in plain water, with maybe a spoonful of bacon grease or a sprinkle of pepper for flavor. This wasn't just a Depression-era trick. Variations of flour dumplings had been feeding families for centuries. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Appalachian region all had their own versions, adapting them to whatever ingredients were on hand. It wasn't a meal designed to impress, it was meant to fill stomachs. And for those who grew up eating them, boiled flour dumplings were proof that even in the hardest times, a little ingenuity could turn flour and water into something that felt like a meal. When life hands you a cow but almost nothing else, you cook the cow's brains. Fried cow brains, or calf's brains, if you want to sound a bit more gourmet, was a Dust Bowl specialty not because people wanted to eat it, but because they had to. They were not fastidious in the past. When you had to fight for your life, you ate everything that was on the animal. Now I know that fried cow brains may sound like something that shouldn't even be considered food, let alone something that might be considered delicious. For this dish, brains were washed in water or milk, dredged in flour, and fried until brown and crispy. Consider them as the first-generation chicken nuggets, if chicken nuggets had a soft core and came with a helping of angst. The flavor? It was mild, almost buttery, and that was the reason why nobody fled from the dish when somebody served it. Cow brains fried were dense in nutrients, especially protein, and thus a good meal during famine. While nowadays people might shudder at the thought of consuming brains, in the past, it was simply Tuesday's supper. And hey, if you put some gravy on top, it might just seem like you're eating gourmet food. Here's a sandwich combo that might make you do a double take: peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Yes, you heard that right. Before PB and J sandwiches became a thing, peanut butter and mayo sandwiches was all the rage. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this one tastes far better than it sounds. In the 1930s, peanut butter and mayonnaise were both affordable and readily available, making them a popular pairing. The creamy, salty peanut butter mixed with the tangy mayo created a unique flavor combination that some people swear by to this day. It might sound strange, but remember, during the Great Depression, you ate what you could afford, and this sandwich was cheap and filling. So, if you're feeling brave and want to try something new, make yourself a peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Who knows, you might discover a new guilty pleasure. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seem to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Now, speaking of retro, tuna jelly salad was a really vintage recipe that started coming into the spotlight around the 60s. This was the time when JellO and gelatin mold-based dishes were getting really popular. The idea was to use the gelatin mold to encase the tuna with a typical salad dressing, and it really worked back then. I'm not exactly sure how people would react to it now, since I think the idea of a tuna and gelatin crossover is a bit too bold for a lot of people's palates. I could always be wrong though, so you tell me, dear viewer. Would you take a tuna jelly salad to work? Or would you just make a quick run for the nearest Wendy's? I wouldn't blame you at all if you picked the second one. The idea behind salads like these was to throw a spin on an otherwise really boring format of cooking. Salads were okay, but they were never something Americans preferred with their whole hearts. Nowadays, that opinion really started to become public sentiment. Plus, as I was previously talking about, most people would opt for Starbucks now. And I'll tell you this right now, tuna, JellO, and caffeine do not go together. So this is a bit of a tricky name to pronounce even when you give it a genuine try, but it's worth knowing about this dish because of how good it is. Bali Mallo Irish lamb stew is something that comes all the way from County Cork, and lamb stew is something that Americans welcome with very open arms. You can particularly find this dish being spread in droves around St. Patrick's Day in any Irish-American community. Whether you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, which even today have a pretty solid amount of Irishmen living in them, you're bound to run into a Bali Mallo stew once in a while. Despite how good of a stew it is, with tender carrots, potatoes, and tender strips of lamb, and how simple the preparation is since it relies mostly on the natural flavors present in the ingredients, this dish actually flopped once before. Well, I wouldn't say it was a true flop, but it did fade out of the memory of the general public before too, That was before the 20th century, but ever since then it has been seeing a bit of a revival thanks to social media and Bali Mallo House, which is what it's named after. Either way, this is one of the best recipes to ever come out of a family cookbook. And if you've ever had one while at an Irish friend's home, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. Okay, this next one sounds like some kind of alien food, but Milorno was a Depression-era kitchen miracle. It was a government-invented mixture of cornmeal and dried milk powder, designed to be a cheap and nutritious substitute for more expensive foods. A research team led by Flora Rose developed Milorno, Milkowato, and Milkweedo cereals in the early 1930s, and they were sold exclusively to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration for distribution to Americans impoverished by the Depression. It was claimed that by substituting Milorno for flour and cornmeal, a family of 5 could eat for less than $5 a week. The best part about Milorno was its versatility. You could use it as a base for porridge, bake it into cornbread, or even use it to thicken soups. And while it might not sound super exciting, Milorno dishes could actually be pretty tasty with the right seasonings and a bit of creativity. With the rise of delicious cereals, there's no room for it in our diets now, but hey, no one's gonna judge you if you want to give it a try. So you know how America and pulled pork go together like jam on toast, right? After all, it's something you can feed a whole crowd and have them feeling full and satisfied. It's a showstopper, but you can make a lot of easy things with it. Most dishes you can make and serve will have people asking you what your recipe is, but that's just how easy pulled pork is to work with. So, when I say this next sentence, hear it with an open mind. How do you feel about cherry cola pulled pork? Yeah, slow-cooked, barbecue-y, savory pulled pork left to simmer in a pool of cherry cola, barbecue sauce, and other seasonings. The first time I heard of this dish, I struggled just to imagine all of those flavors in one bite. Like, barbecue sauce is a dip, pulled pork is a main dish, and cherry cola is a drink. You're used to having all that separately, right? Despite that, since it was all made from things that were so readily available in most homes, and since it was right up the alley of home chefs in their slow cooking era, it took off in a major way. Especially in the South, where everything involved in this dish is something people were already having on a daily basis. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, Just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available. No need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Cold pork pie was weird. It was supposed to be this British savory pastry that was probably the only dish best served cold after revenge, but I think it fell short on a lot of fronts. First, let's start with what constitutes a cold pork pie. This frigidly cold piece of British culture comes fully equipped with American favorites like lard, chopped or ground pork, nutmeg, mace, and lots of other stuffings. Plus, you know how people start experimenting with food and adding their own twists and turns wherever they can, no matter what. Who really sticks to tradition when you have like 5 different kinds of cheese to try? Anyway, while all of that sounds pretty good, fun, and a perfect environment for some serious brainstorming with what you can do with a pork pie, it was the savory jelly and cold aspect of it that kind of didn't stick too well. After the baking, you were supposed to pour a savory jelly made out of pork stock into the pie through a pretty tiny hole in the crust. Once the jelly would set and cool, it would enrich the flavor of the pie even more and help to preserve the meat as well. Pork pies were, for this reason, always served cold. However, America is a place that's really used to having their pork pies hot. And as you can probably tell, that's why you don't see bakeries, homes, or offices having cold pork pie days anymore. Octopus is actually one I bet you've never really heard about before. Octopus used to be considered a food that was pretty much a last resort. It was something that coastal peasants and fishermen ate when they had literally nothing else. It started to turn into a delicacy thanks to Japanese sushi and Italian seafood dishes, but man, it was really underrated. Octopus was considered super difficult to cook. You had to either dry it, or pound it, or slow simmer it, and it was really rubbery. The texture was foreign to a lot of people, so that's why they only ate it when there was nothing else. And naturally, if that's all you do, then that's the association you build. It became synonymous with bad times. It wasn't until lots of restaurants started doing things like pulpo a la gallega, which is a popular Spanish dish, and things like takoyaki and reductions that octopus started to gain respect in gourmet circles. When it comes to sandwiches, only a few were as satisfying as the roast beef sandwich. So, many sandwiches were originally created as a clever way to repurpose leftovers, and this one was no exception. Roast beef sandwiches often started with leftovers from Sunday dinner. The Sunday roast was a time-honored tradition, and any extra beef was used to make delicious sandwiches for lunch the next day. In 1900, the dish was described by the Washington Post as unattractive and as a tired ark in a gravy flood. However, it gained popularity in the coming years when Grandma decided to take matters into her own hands, and by 1931, some critics even went as far as to describe it as a true taste of South Dakota. The bread for Grandma's roast beef sandwich was often homemade, and boy did she know how to dress it up. Whether it was a dollop of horseradish sauce, a spread of mustard, or a smear of mayonnaise, Gram knew exactly what it needed, and if we got lucky, she even snuck in a slice of cheese. All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like. Beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup. But then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. I know this dish might sound plain, but believe me, when your belly is rumbling and your pantry is bare, this stew can be a lifesaver. On the other hand, stuffed bell peppers were an American classic, especially in places like the South. The idea was really similar to the egg-stuffed salad tomatoes I was talking about. Even then, I told you how it's more or less like these bell peppers. The idea here this time was to hollow these peppers out and fill them in with things like rice, tomato sauce, and ground meat. They were also the perfect thing to take to work because you could carry them in just about anything. The more transportable something was, the better it would function as a work lunch. Stuffed bell peppers also had the extra effect of giving you a boost of energy, which was always really nice because desk jobs, as I'm sure all of you might be familiar with, can suck the soul out of you. The reason these were popular in the South is because it's arguably the home of stuffed peppers and all variants of them. Those people love their spice, man. If we take a small intermission from the dessert side of things and step on over to some hearty, comforting, and homely soups, we'll find a golden recipe lost among the cookbooks of the 20th century that don't get to see the light of day anymore. Pea Ham Soup got its name because of how affordable it was. This is probably the cheapest thing on the list to make. Actually, it literally costs just a few cents. All you needed was ham and peas. You'd simmer them in the crock pot with diced ham and some vegetables like potatoes and celery, then slow cook it until the soup got thickened. You'd get this incredibly creamy, lovely soup that was just perfect for winter nights or after a long, exhausting weekend. Maybe you want to ease up on your stomach and eat something healthy for a change, but you still want some familiar flavors to keep you company. A soup like this would be right up your alley. It costs nothing, feels better than most things, and you can make it anytime. You could probably even take a nap and wake up to the scent of the soup slowly cooking, becoming the final product. Also, if you believe that using every part of the animal is a modern concept, you are mistaken. Dust Bowl families were not sparing any part of the pig, including the snout. Pig snouts breaded might sound like something you dare a friend to eat, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicacy. When meat was a rare commodity, the snout was a cheap source of something meaty, chewy, and quite palatable. The snouts were washed, cooked until soft, and then breaded before being deep-fried to golden brown. The result? A crispy outside and a very tasty meat on the inside. Well, yes, the texture may have been somewhat unusual, but when you are hungry, you don't mind. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. To Dust Bowl families, pig snouts breaded were not just edibles, but a way to pay tribute to every pound of what little they had. No part was wasted, while such meals ensured that scarcity became resourcefulness. Nowadays, breaded pig snouts can be found only in some culinary forums, but they are a vivid example of how people tried to feed themselves when there were no chips, but snouts. Would I try it? To put it in perspective, if my grandma was to prepare it with a wink and a smile, I'd be willing to take a bite. Indeed, when you survive, you become brave and perhaps a little curious. But would you try it? Leave us the answer in the comments below. If there's one sandwich you can never go wrong with, it's the old-fashioned grilled cheese sandwich. This one is the epitome of comfort food, and Grandma's version was a childhood favorite. Even the pickiest eaters used to beg for this one. So this one became popular during the Great Depression era, when we had to make do with three of the most common ingredients in our pantries: bread, cheese, and butter. Now, some of us used to get creative with our grilled cheese by adding extras like sliced tomatoes, ham, bacon, or even pickles. But this one was best enjoyed simple and plain. Oh, and let's not forget, it tastes even better when paired with a warm bowl of tomato soup. Before burgers and fries, grilled cheese and tomato soup used to be the ultimate food combo of our dreams. The best part? Most cheese sandwiches are vegetarian and can easily be made vegan by adjusting the type of cheese and oil. For families with little more than pantry staples, stretching a meal was an art form. Tomato gravy. Over rice was a perfect example of how a handful of cheap ingredients could be turned into something warm, filling, and, on the right day, even delicious. Rice was affordable, easy to store, and could be cooked in large batches, making it a go-to base for struggling households. The tomato gravy itself was a simple mix of canned or fresh tomatoes, flour for thickening, and a little fat, usually bacon grease or lard, to give it depth. Some versions were smooth, others chunky, depending on what was on hand. When money was especially tight, even just tomato juice and water could create a thinner, more soup-like version. This dish had roots in the South, where tomato gravy was often served over biscuits. But during the Depression, rice became a common substitute since it was cheaper and stretched further. Leftovers weren't wasted either. Extra gravy could be poured over cornbread or mixed into the next day's meal. It was proof that a little creativity could turn a sparse pantry into a meal that still felt like home. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Bacon. Crackers, I mean, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. Rice salad with curry dressing is probably the epitome of the whole health consciousness movement that dominated so much of the second half of the 90s. Rice salad with curry dressing would also often be made with much healthier ingredients than what people were used to, such as brown rice, quinoa, and more. Bell peppers, cucumbers, and spinach were also popular ingredients to throw in there. To be honest, it's a bit like a chicken katsu curry rice bowl, but without the katsu curry or the fried chicken fillets. This was something we took inspiration from a lot of different cultures from. One of the most popular ones was the Mediterranean version, which really emphasized the use of olives. But people also tried spicier Spanish recipes or more tame and flavorful Italian ones. There were all kinds of ways to have your rice salad, but it was dishes like these that set the stage for curries to become a main, trendy food in America. Once something starts being a work lunch, you know it's made it to the big leagues. It summarizes a lot of what was going on in the 90s too. A push for more healthier food, a strong desire for transportable, easier-to-make recipes, and a fusion of different cultures, recipes, and ideas to basically create uncharted territory. Its golden days from the 20th century aren't something we have anymore, but it's still a knockout option to go for if you're trying to switch your lunch up a little. These recipes might be forgotten, but the stories they carry are still worth remembering. If one sparked a memory or made you curious, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more bites of the past.